I still remember the exact moment I realized my neighbor had decided my property belonged to him. And weirdly enough, it started with a photo and ended with 3 stranded dinner guests standing on a sidewalk looking completely lost. My phone buzzed late on a Tuesday afternoon while I was wrapping up work, and my friend Marcus texted me, "Hey, didn't you own that little lot beside Lombardi's on 8th? Underneath was a picture, and the second I opened it, I felt my stomach drop. Fresh white parking lines had been painted across my asphalt, clean and bright like they'd been done that same day. And tied to a metal post with zip ties was a hand-lettered sign that read "Parking for Lombardi's customers only. Violators towed." I just stared at it for a second thinking maybe Marcus had sent the wrong photo. Maybe there was some angle I wasn't seeing, but no, that was my lot. Every crack in that pavement was familiar to me. My Uncle Walter left it to me when he passed 6 years earlier. It wasn't a huge piece of land, just a narrow 40-foot strip right in downtown Cedar Hollow tucked between an old Italian restaurant and a dry cleaner that somehow survived every economic downer the city threw at it. It wasn't glamorous, but parking downtown had gotten ridiculous over the years, and that strip mattered. A print shop had leased it for a long time, then closed about 8 months before, and I'd left the lot empty while I figured out whether I wanted to lease it again or maybe develop something there. Apparently, 8 months of silence was enough for somebody to start writing themselves into the story. I drove over there before sunset and just sat in my truck for a minute staring through the windshield. The paint was bright enough to reflect the fading light. Somebody had put real money and effort into claiming land that wasn't theirs and somehow felt comfortable enough doing it in broad daylight. Lombardi's was packed like always. People laughing out on the patio, waiters moving fast, glasses clinking. The smell of garlic and bread drifted right over my truck window, and honestly that made me even more irritated because everything looked so normal. Like nobody around there thought anything weird had happened. Like this had just become part of the block overnight. I walked inside the next morning around 10 before lunch service and asked if I could speak with the owner. A guy named Vince Marino came out from the kitchen drying his hands on a white towel, broad shoulders, silver hair slicked back. Looked like the kind of man who'd spent 30 years confidently getting his way and had gotten very used to it. I introduced myself and said, "Morning. I own the lot beside your building. I noticed you painted parking lines on it yesterday." He barely blinked. He looked at me, glanced toward the front window, then gave this little shrug and said, "Oh yeah, that space was sitting empty. Figured nobody was using it." I waited because surely that couldn't be the whole sentence. He kept going. "Honestly, I did you a favor. Cleaned it up, organized it a little. Looks better than it did." I actually laughed because I thought maybe he was joking. He wasn't. I said, "You painted private property and put up a towing sign." He smiled like I was overreacting and leaned against the counter. "Buddy, downtown's busy. Empty land attracts problems. Customers needed parking. I handled it." Then he hit me with the one line that really stuck in my head. "You should probably be thanking me." That was the moment I stopped being annoyed and got very, very calm. Anybody can argue. Anybody can yell. But when somebody's that comfortable standing in your face acting like your ownership is optional, you don't waste the energy. You let paperwork talk. I smiled and nodded and said, "Appreciate your time, Vince." He looked satisfied, like that was settled. Like he'd just explained reality to me and I'd accepted it. I got back in my truck, drove home, opened my laptop, and pulled every property record tied to that parcel. County assessor maps, deed records, archive transfer paperwork from my uncle's estate, everything. Boundaries down to the inch. Then I called a licensed towing company a few blocks away and explained the situation. The dispatcher actually laughed and said, "You'd be amazed how often people assume parking lots are free real estate." We signed a private property towing agreement under my name that afternoon. Then I called a local sign company and ordered 4 bright red metal towaway notices with exact city ordinance citations printed underneath. By Thursday evening, those signs were installed on all 4 corners of the property. Impossible to miss. Professional. Legal. Permanent. And as I stood there watching the last installer tighten bolts into place, I looked over at Vince through Lombardi's front window. He saw me. I know he did. He paused mid-conversation with one of his servers and stared. I gave him a quick nod. He didn't nod back. Friday was coming, and downtown Friday nights were always packed. By 6 o'clock Friday evening, Cedar Hollow was doing what it always did, sidewalks filling up, traffic inching past storefronts, Couples heading to dinner dressed like they'd been looking forward to the weekend all week, and Lombardi's was absolutely slammed. From across the street, I watched the whole thing unfold from inside a coffee shop with a paper cup I barely touched. Vince's customers pulled in one after another and parked right on top of those bright white lines he'd painted like they belonged there. A black SUV backed into the corner spot closest to the restaurant patio. Then a silver sedan. Then a dark blue pickup. Every space filled fast. It honestly felt surreal watching strangers casually stepping onto land they had no idea was private because somebody else had told them it was okay. I didn't blame the customers. They were just hungry and following signs. The issue had never really been them. It was Vince standing there at the hostess stand smiling and waving people toward parking spots he had zero right to control. Around 6:15 the tow truck rolled around the corner exactly on schedule. No sirens, no drama, just smooth and professional. The driver, a guy named Raymond who'd been doing private property enforcement for almost 20 years, gave me a nod through the windshield. I nodded back. He checked the signs, checked the paperwork, and got to work. Fast, efficient, legal. The black SUV disappeared first. Then the sedan. Then the pickup. By the time the third vehicle was hooked up and heading down the block, you honestly couldn't tell anything had happened unless you knew what had been there 5 minutes earlier. The empty spaces looked almost peaceful. Then the restaurant doors flew open. A younger couple came out first, laughing about something until they looked toward the curb and froze. The woman turned in a circle, like maybe she'd parked somewhere else. The guy patted his pockets and hit the lock button on his keys 3 times even though there was nothing left to unlock. A few seconds later another customer stormed out, then another. Confusion spread fast. People talking over each other, looking up and down the street. Then Vince pushed through the front door and immediately locked eyes with the red signs posted around the perimeter. I could see the exact second everything clicked for him. He spun around scanning the lot, then looked across the street and spotted me through the coffee shop window. He started walking before he even thought about it, crossed traffic without waiting, shoved the door open hard enough to ring the bell twice, and marched right over to my table. "What the hell did you do?" he snapped, loud enough that half the room looked over. I stayed seated. I enforced private property towing. His face turned red instantly. Those were my customers. I took a sip of coffee and said, "Actually, Vince, they were parked on my lot." He leaned over the table. "You had no right." That almost made me smile. I had every right. My name's on the deed. The towing company has a signed contract. The signs cite city ordinance. You saw them yesterday. For a second, he looked like he wanted to argue every word, but facts don't leave much room to improvise. He lowered his voice and said, "You embarrassed me in front of everybody." I said, "No. You painted parking lines on land you don't own and invited people onto it. That part happened before I ever got involved." He stood there breathing hard, then gave me this sharp little laugh like he still thought confidence alone could reverse reality. "You're really making this a thing." I looked him dead in the eye. "You made it a thing Tuesday when you painted my asphalt." He stared another second, then turned and walked back out. Through the front glass, I could see the sidewalk packed with confused customers and Vince trying to explain himself with his hands moving faster than his mouth. One woman pointed toward the signs and clearly asked a question he didn't have a clean answer for. Somebody else shook their head and walked away. By 8 that night, my phone rang twice. "Vince." I let it go to voicemail both times. The first message was angry. Lots of "unbelievable," and "we can work this out," and "you've made a huge mistake." The second voicemail was calmer, which somehow sounded more irritated. "Call me back. We need to settle this like adults." I didn't call back. Saturday morning, I drove past the lot. The painted white lines were still there, but nobody parked on them. The red tow-away notices stood bright against the metal posts. Vince was outside near the patio talking to a produce delivery guy and stopped when he saw me. We both just looked at each other for a second. No wave, no smile. Then he went back to unloading tomatoes like nothing happened. Monday afternoon, a certified envelope arrived from a law office downtown. Vince had apparently decided to escalate. His attorney claimed I'd interfered with business operations and caused damages through what they described as aggressive enforcement. I actually laughed out loud reading that one at my kitchen table. Aggressive enforcement. Like city code had somehow hurt their feelings. I forwarded it to my attorney, Dana Mercer, who had handled real estate work for my family for years and knew exactly how much patience to bring to situations like this. She read the letter and called me 10 minutes later. He's bluffing, she said immediately. But let's answer clearly. So we did. Dana sent back a response with the recorded deed, parcel map, assessor documentation, time-stamped photos of every tow-away sign, copies of the towing agreement, and installation receipts from the sign company. Every piece neat and dated. No threats. No emotion. Just facts. That's the thing people underestimate about paperwork. It doesn't get angry. It doesn't raise its voice. It just sits there and quietly refuses to move. 2 days later, silence. No second letter. No follow-up. No court filing. Nothing. But something did happen that week that honestly surprised me. A few other business owners on the block started talking. The dry cleaner owner next door stopped me outside and said, "About time somebody checked Vince. He's been pushing boundaries around here for years." A bookstore owner half a block down told me Vince had once tried to claim part of the alley behind her delivery entrance because he thought customers might use it. Apparently, this wasn't some one-time misunderstanding. It was a pattern. Vince had built a reputation on acting first and assuming nobody wanted the hassle of pushing back. And maybe that strategy had worked for him long enough that he genuinely believed this would work too. But every time I drove by and saw those red signs standing where his handwritten one used to be, I could tell he hated being reminded that not everybody folds. The funniest part was watching his dinner crowd adjust. For a while, customers would still pull halfway into the lot, see the signs, and immediately back out. A couple even walked into the restaurant pointing toward the posts like they were asking questions before ordering. Vince had valet cones delivered 2 weeks later and squeezed parking onto the street instead. Every time I saw those cones lined up tight against the curb, I had to laugh a little, because none of that would have happened if he'd just asked one simple question the first day instead of treating empty land like an invitation. And then one Thursday afternoon, almost 3 weeks later, I walked over to inspect the pavement and noticed something new. I stood there looking down at the pavement and saw that somebody had started trying to cover the white parking lines. Not professionally either. No paving crew, no resurfacing company. Just rough black sealant brushed over the paint in uneven streaks like somebody had gotten tired of seeing the reminder and decided to erase it themselves. The edges were sloppy. You could still clearly see the bright white underneath if the sun hit it at the right angle. And honestly, that made me laugh harder than it should have, because it felt exactly like Vince trying to rewrite something after the paperwork already settled it. I was still standing there when the side door to Lombardi's opened and Vince stepped out carrying a box of produce. He saw me looking down and paused. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he set the box down and gave this dry little shrug. Figured it looked cleaner. I nodded. Still shows through. He glanced at the pavement and let out a breath through his nose. Yeah, I guess it does. There wasn't much anger left in his voice anymore. Mostly irritation. Pride bruised a little deeper than he wanted to admit. I leaned against the post beside one of the red signs, and he stayed where he was. The weird thing was, after all the tension and all the calls and the legal letter, standing there in daylight with no audience felt strangely normal. Like two people who'd finally run out of things to pretend about. Vince looked over and said, "You know downtown parking's a nightmare." I laughed. "I'm aware." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Friday nights get ugly around here. Still not a reason to repaint somebody else's land." He nodded once, slow, then gave me a look that felt more honest than anything he'd said since Tuesday morning. "I really thought you weren't doing anything with it." I said, "That's the thing, thinking and knowing aren't the same." He cracked half a smile at that and shook his head. "Yeah, heard that lesson loud and clear." Then he picked up the produce box and headed inside. No apology exactly. Vince didn't strike me as the kind of man built for apologies. But it was probably the closest thing I was ever getting, and weirdly enough I didn't need anything more than that. The lot stayed quiet after that. I leased it out a couple months later to a local accounting office nearby that needed employee parking during the week. Clean contract. Good tenants. Easy arrangement. Sometimes on Friday evenings I'd still walk past the block, just because downtown Cedar Hollow had always been one of those places where everybody somehow knew everybody's business without admitting it. Lombardi stayed busy. Vince kept the patio full. The valet cones stayed lined up out front. We'd see each other now and then. Small nod. Nothing dramatic. Life moved on. But every once in a while somebody new would park halfway into my lot, spot the red tow-away signs, and quickly reverse like they touched a hot stove. And every single time Vince's hostess would rush out, and wave them toward the curb before they crossed the line. That part always made me smile. The faded white stripes stayed visible for months under the sealant, ghost marks in the asphalt, and honestly I left them there on purpose. I could have repaved the whole thing, could have made it look brand new, but I kind of liked the reminder. It felt like proof that assumptions leave marks even after they're corrected, and I still think about how differently the whole thing could have gone. If Vince had walked over one afternoon and simply said, "Hey, I noticed the lot's empty. Any chance we can work something out?" I probably would have been open to a lease. We could have made money together. His customers would have had parking. Everyone wins. Instead, he picked confidence over conversation and painted first. And once somebody decides your silence means permission, they usually don't expect you to answer with paperwork. That's probably the part one keep coming back to. Not the towing. Not the lawyer letter. Not even standing in the coffee shop watching his dinner rush unravel in real time. It's how often people assume the quiet person won't push back, that if something looks unused or available or easy to take, then maybe nobody will notice. Maybe nobody will care enough. Maybe nobody wants the trouble. Until one day they do. And suddenly, all that confidence gets very quiet. So I'm curious what you think. Was I too harsh for towing those cars without giving Vince another warning? Or was that exactly the consequence he earned the second he painted lines on property that wasn't his? Let me know down in the comments because I've heard both sides ever since it happened, and honestly I still get different answers depending on who I ask. And if you've ever had somebody assume your property, your boundaries, or your patience belonged to them just because you stayed quiet for a while, share that story too. I read every one of them. Sometimes the loudest lesson a person ever learns starts with a simple sentence nobody expected to hear. That's not yours.